Good evening, and thank you for joining another SPJ International Community IC Talk. I am Nerissa Young, Professor of Instruction at the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University in beautiful Athens, Ohio. Our topic tonight is press freedom. After the general election, my boss and I began joking that we'd be in jail soon. I told her I wanted to be in the same cell with her and called dibs on the top bunk. This is where we are, folks. Before we start the conversation, and as people continue to get logged in, there are some housekeeping items we need to take care of. Please use the chat feature to let us know where you're from. The format today is simple. The guest and I will have a conversation. If along the way you have a question for our guest, please use the Q&A function, not the chat feature. So chat, tell us where you're calling in from, and Q&A to pose a question to our guest speaker. The co-chairman of the international community, the multi-talented Dan Kubisky, and I will keep an eye on that window. Dan will also be keeping an eye on the chat window in case you have any questions about SPJ, the international community, or have technical issues. He will also be posting links and information related to the IC and our discussion. Just as a reminder, this conversation is being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube channel. Welcome again to those who just got logged in. It's great to see folks from New Hampshire, South Carolina, Illinois, Florida, and the list goes on. Our guest is Kirstin McCudden. She is Vice President of Editorial for Freedom of the Press Foundation. Kirstin oversees strategy and standards for the nonprofit. She's also managing editor of the repository for press freedom violations in the United States, also known as the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. Kirstin is an award-winning editor with more than 2 decades in journalism, from legacy media to digital news outlets in St. Petersburg, Florida, Austin, Kansas City, and Geneva, Switzerland. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Missouri's School of Journalism. Go Tigers. Kirstin, thank you for being here.
Wow, a tiger shout out. Thank
Well,
you.
well, we got to take bobcats need to be friendly to the fellow cats. Kirstin and I met last week and agreed that we want tonight's session to offer practical assistance to journalists who are concerned about their personal safety and or the ability of their newsrooms to continue their roles in ensuring democracy in the U.S. Kirstin, please spend a few minutes explaining how the Freedom of the Press Foundation and the Press Freedom Tracker serve journalists and journalism. Dan will be sharing those links in the chat box.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Narisa. Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for being here tonight. We know it's like the final hours of President Day sales, so we're going to get to it. You can get your evening back. I am with Freedom of the Press Foundation, and we protect and defend press freedom. What does that mean and how? If We're at freedom.press, and it's a service organization. Thank you. Hi, Houston. In that regard, we have an advocacy team working behind the scenes and in front of the scenes uh, to get loud, I say, about threats or violations to the First Amendment. But what also makes FPF special are the tools and the technology aspects of the organization. And we're going to walk through all of them tonight, and we're going to have time to get deeper if you have a specific question or want to see something. I'm really happy to do that to get into the weeds. So, FPF. We run Secure Drop, and some of you here may already be familiar with Secure Drop. That is an open source, secure whistleblowing submission system. It allows sources and journalists, be it in newsrooms, large, small, or independent journalists, to communicate securely. We've been running that, and we also run Danger Zone. We keep up and run Danger Zone, another open source tool that clears out your PDFs makes them safe to open, I should say. As journalists, We don't have the ability to ignore a PDF when it or an attachment when it comes in. It might be something very important. Danger Zone is a tool that allows you to open a PDF safely. Those are two of the tools we have at FPF. We also have an incredible digital security training team. That team incredible on the ground working with journalists, again, at newsrooms, big, small, independent journalists, teaching you about digital security. And what that is like the computer we're on tonight. You're working from home. How safe? Are you using a VPN? If you needed to do a highly secure or a medium secure or a low secure conversation with a source, or with your newsroom or just with a buddy, is your computer and are you ready for that task? That's what our digital security team does. Also, your phone. You might be out in the fields, live streaming a protest, an event. Maybe you drop your phone. How secure is how hard is it to get into that phone? Maybe it's seized by the police. Can they get into it easily? How tough is that? That's what our digital security training team is doing every day. And also the guides that we'll be looking at later to really help you be prepared in that digital security sense. And then FPF finally also has the US Press Freedom Tracker. We'll be talking about that a lot tonight. It's a news database. We document virtually every aggression against the press in the United States. So this is US focused. And what's an aggression? An arrest of a journalist, a detainment, detention, an assault, but also a subpoena. If you get a legal order to turn over your protected work material, all of that is documented in the US Press Freedom Tracker. And the reason for that is so we can look, all of us can look, the public can look at any time and better understand what the state of press freedom is in the United States.
Right. So there are a lot of tools out there to assist with practical things. Folks, I hope you are checking those links and copying those to refer to later so that you can take advantage of those tools. The tracker shows that 2020 was far and away the worst year between 2017 and 2024 for assaults on journalists by law enforcement and private individuals, with 1,061 encounters. It appears 2024 was a much less violent election year with 80. What is the most common threat journalists are facing in 2025, and how can they prepare for it?
Whew. All right, so there's a couple parts in there. I'm gonna go ahead, if y'all don't mind, I'm gonna put up the tracker because I think we can talk about it and you can sort of understand. Let me know that you can see it. Yes. This is the US Press Freedom Tracker. It's a database, and I scroll kind of fast sometimes. Are we okay seeing it? Yeah, thumbs up. The numbers you're referring to are here in the tracker. In 2020, and I'm going to go to 2020 live here, you can see it was a really, I'm going to say incredible, in the sense of the word incredible, and out an unprecedented year for press freedom violations in the US. And we have to remember 2020, like every year here in the tracker, it launched in 2017. That's as far back as we go. 2020 was a special year. It was an election year, very widely contested. As of May, that big spike that you see on the screen, that's when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and national Black Lives Matter social justice protests began and journalists covering them. And we can remember that the law enforcement response was really brutal to the protesters, very harsh, and to the journalists covering them. So you see this huge spike. Most of these occurred throughout the year at national, from May through the end of the year, protests, assaults, arrests of journalists. So 2020 had general election, social unrest, and we were still in the middle of a global pandemic. 2024, actually wasn't all that different on a few aspects. There were protests, the Israel-Gaza war. We saw those especially at college campuses. You see a spike here in April and in May in 2024. Those The difference of 2024 was the duration didn't go as long. School lit out, college campuses really cracked down on students protesting, and the duration wasn't as long as in 2020. There was a national election, not a global pandemic. There was a national election, but we did not see the same number of protests nationally. There was no January 6, 2025. So 2020 into 2021 was different from how 2024 into 2025. And that's why you're seeing very different numbers in two different election years. It's still worth noting, however, what we're looking at in 2024, our last full year, nearly 50 journalists were arrested or detained while doing their job. 80 were assaulted. So it was not a zero year by any stretch of the imagination. It's just hard to compare to 2020.
Yeah,
Now,
thank you for
yeah,
explaining the data, because if you don't know the methodology behind it, it looks, oh well, gee, how far we've come, but it's nothing to
right.
celebrate.
Yeah. Well, in that every year you do have like it's to compare year over year, you have to know what's going on, or remember what's going on in the US. You're asking like the question is what's a common threat for journalists in 2025? And I do say that the tracker is not a predictive tool, so it's not like a magic 8 ball that we can shake and see what's going to happen to journalists. Unfortunately, it is more of a historical timestamp of what has been happening to journalists, and it helps put it all in context. But we can take a few things away. Journalists are, according to tracker data, most at risk at protests. And we see that year over year. So during the first Trump administration and those BLM protests, social justice protests of 2020 that we were talking about, Trump did call in the National Guard, certainly in Oregon, DC. And if Americans take to the street, foreign policy, domestic over domestic policy, newsrooms should prepare for the same kind of resistance to the right of assembly as before, and think about how that affects the journalists in the field.
Okay. We want to invite you to ask a question as you have it. And we have a question from Celia Wexler. Hey, Celia, do you track lawsuits against reporters?
Okay, great question. The so if it's a defamation case, there are lots of journalists who are involved in lawsuits. So if you are compelled to turn over work product, then yes, if that makes sense. If you receive a subpoena or a legal order, yes. If a journalist has been assaulted, for example, and then they sue either the federal or local law enforcement, we also track that as a way to show what we can, what was it to try to measure what accountability was like. How many journalists sued over any period of years after a press freedom violation, and what were the outcomes of those lawsuits? Those are the type of lawsuits we track.
Okay, so journalists are most vulnerable when they are going out to cover protests. So you need to gear up to maybe take a safety course. Dan, is there a webinar on SPJ's website dealing with safety for journalists? I'm sorry if I can't recall. Uh,
I'll take a look, and if I
okay.
find the link, I'll post it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and actually, if you don't mind, I'll show you a few that we have
Okay,
because I
great.
do want you, let's see, I'm going to close this. Got a thumbs this out. Good. This is our digital security education at Freedom of the Press Foundation. So if you walk away with nothing else tonight, do know that there are resources. SPJ is a great partner. Our digital security education, I'm going to scroll, I'll try to do it slowly. There are lots of guides and resources, and I'm going to show you some here. One is boop, 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 reporting in the field.
Okay.
So if you are a reporter and you spend time in the field, this is a great curation of resources and guides. They start at 101, so don't feel intimidated. Like, oh, I don't know how to hop in here. It's starts what we call 101, first steps, all the way up to more advanced security. So this is reporting in the field. I also want you to see, I gotta move this little guy, source protection, which is something we should all be thinking about if we have not already been thinking about it. So if you were already thinking about it, there's some advanced resources here. If you haven't yet been thinking about it, great place to start as well. We have an Ask a Security trainer. You can ask Q&As of our team. There's also just lots of guides on source protection. So again, making those communications very secure. That's going to protect you, and that's going to protect and help build trust with your sources when they know that you are taking steps to protect them as well.
Okay. Just in case somebody doesn't know what Signal is, would you explain, Kirstin?
Sure. Signal's an app, a lot like WhatsApp is another one. Also, your iMessages. What's different about Signal is that there's end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp also has this feature now, but you have to both turn it on. Signal, it is built in also both sides end-to-end encryption, and that means it's jumbled up. If anybody were to see it, your communication can't be read.
All right. A lot of journalists have moved to that for those secure reasons, especially in talking with sources. Okay. This is great. Thank you. And I also want to give a shout out to the SPJ DC Pro chapter co-sponsoring tonight's discussions. Let me check for Q&A. Hey, we've
Yeah.
got, go ahead, Kirstin.
Well, I would love, Will, can you, the question is there a spectrum of severity that these sources include by fiscal year other than types of listed charges? Can you help me understand? Are we looking at, because I know I moved from the tracker back to freedom.press. Could you elaborate? And you do have to type it, I'm sorry. So while you're
Yes.
typing, so I'm going to come back and look for that. So yeah.
All right. So hold that thought and type, Will, and thanks for joining us. So we know a lot of proposed legislation is out there floating around and all kinds of legal things that are going on just 1 month into the Trump administration. How can journalists use existing laws to protect their free press and free speech rights? Sometimes we may not be aware of what's out there that can help us, and we may not know where there are some loopholes that we can explore or holes that are wide enough to drive a tractor through but aren't used or known very much that journalists can tap into. And is there any congressional interest at all? What are you hearing? Not data, but just, what are you hearing as somebody who has eyes and ears on this issue? Is Congress interested at all in expanding those freedoms? The trend right now seems to be contracting them, but I'm looking for hope here, if there is some.
Oh, well, is there any congressional interest at all in expanding those freedoms?
Journalists.
Right. We just saw the Press Act, which was a bill to create a
Yeah.
federal shield law. It failed for at least the second time in the Senate in December. So no, Congress did not make expanding those freedoms a priority. In the last administration, unlikely we're going to see the Press Act again this year. We'll always try for it though, because as we know, the Press Act, so that's a federal shield law. The shield laws are designed to protect reporters' privilege. They do vary in scope. So as far as how can we use existing laws, my recommendation is to sort of understand your jurisdiction that you are working in, because they do vary both by state and sometimes even on a municipal level. Wyoming doesn't have a shield law at all right now. It's the only one. Others recognize if you're a digital only outlet, which we think would be normal, but in Nevada, it added it recognized digital only outlets only in 2019 and after a Supreme Court challenge. So knowing where you're working and the laws there are really the best thing that you can do. And another example of that is if you're a reporter and you're going out to cover that protest that we already said was a more likely dangerous place for journalists, know those jurisdictional rules down to the county. Is there a curfew, which are called sometimes during times of heavy protest? Are journalists exempt from it? That's your question to ask. If not, you want to find out why. You want to talk to your local press club and really put pressure on the mayor to exempt journalists from it. But it does come down. So the only advice that can go for everybody is to know where you are at the time and to understand those jurisdictional rules. Um, the only other blanket advice that I give is self-identifying as a journalist. So what we do hear from journalists on who are reporting in the field is that it's not always safe to wear a large and obvious press credential. We don't have hats that have a little press card in them anymore. But if you have an interaction, so that's fine. Yeah, you don't have to wear press credentials. Some wear them on their sleeves, some keep them in their back pocket. But if you, certainly with any interaction with law enforcement, identifying yourself as press is important for setting up any rights you would have in that jurisdiction.
Make sure you research your own state shield laws because they vary. Ohio's protects only legacy media, not even online or digital. It needs an update and some.
It'll probably, like Innovata, take a challenge, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Okay. All right. Will, we missed you. Maybe Will's grabbing some dinner. And we'll be back with us here shortly to follow up so we can answer that question. Again, put questions in the Q&A chat for us, and we'll be happy for Kirstin to take those. Kirstin told me last week that the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker contributes data to the World Press Freedom Index, which is maintained by RSF, Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières. The results from 2024 show the U.S. ranked 55 out of 180 countries. What's interesting about that index is that several former Soviet bloc countries ranked ahead of the U.S. Since the U.S. is supposedly the template for democracy and a democratic press, what are we doing wrong that we should be changing in the U.S.?
So
probably a bigger question than we can answer tonight, but some broad strokes, maybe some suggestions.
Yeah, and it's worth a discussion, right? The US did drop 10 places actually from 2023 to 2024. The number that you meant, the 55, ranking 55 out of 180-ish countries, in the 40s, kind of for the last decade. So why that 10 place drop over the year? And RSF in its analysis and when it talks about the three major reasons, and they're all applicable still. One being, oh, thank you for that index, that threats from those in power. So, which is ongoing. Another, the Marion County raid, it will be the best example of this, of law enforcement's raid on newsrooms, one in Alabama, one in Kansas, another in Florida. Those are alarming. And just trust in media has continued to grow, or trust in media has continued to decline, however, whatever your glass is. Those are major reasons why the U.S. continues to decline over, and certainly dropped 10 places in 1 year's time. And that was actually, RSF does it before the general election. So that was getting data for the year before the year was fully out. So not entirely knowing what the next administration is going to bring.
Do you think the rhetoric plays a role, or people already distrusted the media? I mean, President Trump made it clear in his first administration he's no fan of news organizations and has already taken steps to make it pretty clear he's not happy with ones already in his second term, the Associated Press, no access to the Oval Office, no access to the White House press briefing room. We expect some of those things may continue for other news organizations whose coverage he doesn't like. Is it a wag the dog type of things, or is it, I mean, do people really pay that much attention to what they hear?
You know, it goes to your question of what should we be doing about this? What do we do with all of this information that's coming in? And be it looking at the RSF index, looking at the tracker, what RSF does is take this information on an aggregate. It looks at tracker data, but it also talks to a lot of journalists who are doing the work and trying to understand what kind of threats they're feeling. The tracker is the same. You can think of it as on a micro, large US view or a micro view. We can, we look at individual journalist stories, and I really think the takeaway from both of these and all this information out there is that we don't sleep on it, which is to say, we have this information, we see what's happening to journalists, and then using it in a way to work together. Now, it really is the time to work together to say we see what's happening. A journalist was not assaulted in 2024. 80 journalists were assaulted in 2024. That is, while it's not the number of 2020, it's an unacceptable number as it is. So what we can really do is use these resources, certainly to keep ourselves safe and to keep our sources safe, but also to put weight behind any collective action.
Okay. We have a question from James. In what ways can the industry, we've been talking very practically about individual journalists and individual newsrooms, but what can the industry do to take steps to counter these threats?
Yeah, great question. There are support organizations like FPF, like RSF, like CPJ, like our Reporters Committee, like SPJ, of course, all of which are on hand to support and to service working journalists in so many ways. So what can we do as an industry? I think in the past, we've let these organizations like FPF take up a lot of the slack in being loud about what's going on. And then that way, reporters don't have to be part of the story. And it is time to be part of the story because it's about press freedom as a whole. So, which is large. And then on a smaller level is get involved. I think there are when we talk about collective action, there's deciding for your newsroom, if you're in a leadership position or if you're in a vocal position, what kind of outward position you want to take. Do you stand with the AP and boycott going to the Oval Office? Do you decide to share your photos with a wider audience that the AP can't get to? Deciding what it is for you in your newsroom, how to be involved right now with the facts that we have.
So you're saying use the powers that you have available to you, which include a bully pulpit with editorials. I don't know if any local news stations still do commentaries or not, but I kind of miss them. I miss those broadcast commentaries, which are, basically an opinion column, but on the air. And that would be helpful. Okay, it's great. Will has checked back in to follow up. In terms of legal consequences, certain journalists are kept from input on a particular situation or policy issue. For example, the prospect of climate change is an often overlooked topic in how legacy media are encouraged to expel those who question whether carbon credits are valid to the expenditure and demand of going green. My question is whether there's a specific area of proof listed on any of these websites that show data of a divide in the certain types of assaults besides that of which depends on their suppression. Thank you, Will, for filling in the gaps there for us.
Yeah, in terms of legal consequences, um, thank you. Okay. So as far as the assaults on the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, I will tell you how we track them and in hopes that that sort of answers where what the tracker does. And when we look at assaults, we can divide them, and you can divide them on the website by the assailant. So while it's not about what they were covering, which is so it's not by beat, it's by who the assailant was. A private individual, so an assault by an individual, or law enforcement are two. There's other categories. Was it a political figure, a public figure? So it's more by assailant rather than by beat.
Okay. Oh, but one thing, let me just throw out while we're talking about assaults on journalists is when I'm talking with students about stories that they're working on and they're filing Freedom of Information Act requests, one of the pieces of advice I frequently give them is report about your efforts. So that becomes the story, because if you can't get those documents, but you are reporting what the news organization is trying to get from those documents and why it's an important story, cover that part of it. Because just because someone doesn't respond to your FOIA doesn't mean you don't have a story. And I would say too, if your journalists are coming under attack, maybe these news organizations need to report that, have someone else in the newsroom talk about what happened to that reporter. Because if we're not talking about it, it's not happening. It's like a tree falling in the forest, in a manner of speaking. And so some news coverage from respective organizations, that helps it get on the radar to then be placed in the Press Freedom Tracker, doesn't it?
That's right. And we can't report about what we don't know about, and there's certainly always more. We're certain of that. But what we can only do what is either sent into us. We have a tip submission portal. If anybody, please do share it with your newsroom. We also are looking for reports of it. So we have the way that we find press freedom violations is, I think of it as a push and pull. We have sources who are helping us. They're like, oh, we saw so and so get arrested last night, or another reporter was assaulted. But certainly when it comes to legal notices, for example, a subpoena, we know sometimes the news organization has received a subpoena, but is choosing not to publicize it. And sometimes we find out about it later. Sometimes we can see it in a docket on a public database. And that is the newsroom's right. Sometimes they want to work through back channels before making things very public. If something is public, it goes in the database. If
Right.
a journalist asks to be anonymous, we do respect that. We, just like anybody who publishes anonymous sources, we let them know we can do all that we can to keep their name out of the database. Sometimes there is so much live streaming going on that if somebody, we said we can only protect, but these are the steps that we are taking to protect their name. So we do publish anonymous assaults, arrests, anything in the tracker, any of the categories. If there is certainly fear of retribution. We have a denial of access category, for example. And one thing we hear from journalists in the field, denial of access is a meeting should be open, for example, but it isn't. And certainly if you are in a city where the legislators and they know you might not want to go run it like to the tracker and say, hey, I was left out of this meeting, because you don't want to lose access later. And that is something that as the tracker, we struggle with to really make sure people understand, yes, but there might be a next time, or if you don't put it in now, you can't show a pattern of retribution for publishing something that they didn't like. So there are really good reasons to report.
And valid reasons to not report. Uh,
Mhm.
one thing I would like to add here is be a careful reader of your state's public records and public meetings laws. Most of them are written vaguely to benefit those who would like to violate, but the vagueness in those laws also means that they are open to being challenged. And the Supreme Court has said that the burden is on the government to show why the record or the meeting should not be public. So use that and use your opportunities to question, to ask, to share the law, to do a little bit of teaching the law. Sometimes I've done that before in my career. This is what the law is. This is why I'm asking this. And you're obligated under the state law to provide this information. And that way you can sometimes resolve things before it comes to a FOIA or before it comes, to someone standing up in a meeting and doing a Suzanne Sugarbaker, excuse me, until you get noticed and then objecting. So I mean, I've done both. And why are you going into executive session? I don't know, but we just are. And I'm like, well, you have to quote the code. You have to tell so I know what idea you're talking about. And the other thing too, I would like to say to people is just because you're journalists, don't feel like you have to accept the abuse. Do not feel like that has to be part of the job. I teach a journalism and trauma class. We talk about the harassment, the trolling, the cyber hate, the digital stalking, the real stalking. So you need to not be bashful if you feel that your personal safety is at risk about calling law enforcement and reporting this information, because there are a lot of crimes out there now that can deal with it. Now that we're further along on this journey of digital media and what can and cannot be done online, but don't feel like you just have to take it because you're a journalist. We wouldn't expect somebody who cleans toilets to expect somebody to come and kick them in the knees every day. Okay, that's not what they signed up for, and this is not what you signed up for, to take that type of abuse. Am I in line for saying that, Kirstin?
And definitely, and you touched on know your jurisdiction, right? Know your local rules, and that comes into play time and time again. And that's why it's harder when you go into, if you're being sent as a journalist to another place, to do that quick check, and then where you are based to do a longer in-depth check. Know your rights is such a huge part of it.
Yeah, RCFP, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press.org. Dan, if you wouldn't mind to stick that in the chat. It has summaries of most of the states in the U.S., but you can also consult your state's code and look for the chapter that deals with open meetings, open records, etc., and read for yourself. Don't take someone else's word for what it is. We have questions, and we're glad to see those. Sue Dorfman is asking a question about, I heard from a federal worker that an email went out that subscriptions to publications such as the New York Times and Politico can no longer be purchased using a federal credit card. My question is not so much about the purchasing per se, it's about whether people who have used these news media can no longer expense purchase them. Thoughts, please, Kirstin.
Oh, that's a tax question. No, it's it's a great question because it's changing so quickly. I'd say that's a tax question. What you're referring to is right that Politico subscriptions were being used federal. I think if you are not a federal worker, that nothing has changed for how you file your taxes. But I'm not a tax attorney.
Yeah. All right. And we have a question from Tara Heptonstall. In terms of rebuilding trust, this is a great question. Has there been a concerted effort to educate the public about which outlets follow SPJ ethics policies and what efforts are underway to require influencer journalists, like the ones the White House is now letting in the press room, to follow ethics policies? I'm going to let you take a crack at that, and then I may chime in with a couple of things.
Yeah, and this is I'd say no concerted efforts. But this is a great place, where for SPJ to be loud about what its ethics policies are, what ethics policies are in general. I was just speaking of Reporters Committee, a great webinar about protecting yourself as a both as a nonprofit, so for newsrooms or for an organization like mine, and thinking about being very transparent with a lot of your policies is good practice. Always has been, but especially right now. And that includes your ethics policies, that includes your tax filings. And what are efforts underway to require influencer journalism or new media in the White House to follow ethics policy? You know, journalism does take all forms. We we recognize the right of a press to is wider than being under a legacy newsroom umbrella, for example. That an influencer is doing journalism, that a live streamer is doing journalism in the sense of going to an event, wanting to take information and disseminate it to the public. As you know, as we know, none of us are required to work under any set of policies. We have capital J journalism. We have a general agreement that these are our ethics policies, but they are not required for anybody to be a journalist.
And SPJ has had multiple discussions about enforcement of its ethics code. And we keep coming back to if we put enforcement in there, does that provide entree for the government then to pile on? And if SPJ puts enforcement in there, who does the enforcing and what are the penalties going to be? We also recognize that not all corporations that own newsrooms may be following SPJ's code, aware of it, or support it. And so if there's an enforcement in there, the individual journalist may be, hey, this is how I'm going to live my life. But corporate is saying, these are the policies we're going to abide by. That puts the journalist in a tenuous position. So this is something that has come up, but from an SPJ ethics committee, and I was on the committee for 15 years during the two revisions back time, and the reluctance of enforcement is it okay? Does that give the government a chance to constrict the First Amendment? Could that be weaponized and turn into regulation of media? So we're trying to be cognizant of that. So it is a voluntary code. Other newsrooms have their particular codes. Other news organizations have their codes. National Press Photographers Association, Online News Association, and SPJ and College Media Association has a code of ethics. So there are a lot of codes out there to get discussion from. And I would encourage you to look at all of those because they're not RTDNA as well. They are not cookie cutters. And my students in my journalism and trauma class just looked at all of those. So I would recommend, again, know what you're dealing with. Be careful readers. We have another question. What about the AP dilemma? What is our stance? Are you talking about the Associated Press, Ronnie? Because SPJ did put out a statement, I think yesterday or day before, saying that SPJ is against a news outlet being denied access. Of course, okay, thank you. So SPJ is on the record supporting the Associated Press. I can't speak for anyone else.
Yeah, as is Freedom of the Press Foundation.
Okay, great. It's good to know. There were several organizations now that thank you for reminding me. There were several news organizations that joined that and affinity organizations like SPJ. Okay. We have other questions. We've still got plenty of time for some discussion here. No open questions. Well, okay. I love FPF. This is from James again. We got fan mail here.
Oh my
How do I
goodness.
come work for y'all? Do you have any job openings?
We have a careers page, James. Thank you for loving FPF. I do too. I've been here for just more than 6 years now. It does really specialized work, really incredible work. But yeah, go look at the jobs page. There's, I know we have a trainer opening right now, reporter opening, and possibly others.
Okay. Going back to an earlier question, one of SPJ's former national presidents, Lynn Walsh, is now the Deputy Executive Director of the Trusting News Project, which is a nonprofit effort where they're working with local communities, serving as a liaison between newsrooms and their communities to come in and work on projects that can help those news organizations in those communities regain some of that trust. And Lynn was a guest speaker a week ago in my journalism and trauma class, again, speaking about ethics codes. And I echo what Kirstin said earlier, be transparent. And the example she used on a recent project is the use of AI in news reporting. And their findings was people were not against using AI for news purposes, so long as it is disclosed in the story. So I don't know if this has gone out of fashion, but it used to be if there was a big issue in your community, usually the editorial, and I'm a legacy media child, what can I say? Usually there was an editorial talking about that issue or why we're covering it or why we think it's important. So there are opportunities again for commentaries. I know as journalists, we feel like, well, I don't have to explain myself. I cover the news. What's the big mystery about it? Well, for most people, it is a big mystery, and they really don't know what we do. They don't think we have any ethics. They think if we have it, whatever we have, we just rush to digital, we rush to broadcast, we rush to whatever, the web, and share that information without deliberation, without additional thought, without holding it for an hour to confirm something. So I think there can be a role in explaining how the newsroom works in appropriate circumstances, especially if it's something big that's an issue of importance to the community. Are they telling us how to cover the news? No, we're explaining to them why we're doing what we're doing and why we're making certain decisions. And I've had pushback from a publisher when I worked for a small paper in Mississippi. I'm like, an editorial saying, here's why we waited before disclosing this name, and all of our competitors went immediately with it. I think there's a role here. And he's like, well, I don't have to explain myself. I didn't stay there very long, but there were other reasons too. In New York, a question from Robert Anthony. We're working to maintain press access to police radio transmissions, which are now in the process of being encrypted. Is the foundation tracking such access?
All great questions tonight. Know of it. So it is something that you won't likely see in the US Press Freedom Tracker, but you will hear from our advocacy team about. It's happening in New York. There's another state where it has been encrypted, and I know we've written about it. It just means everybody loses access. I'd love to hear more, but certainly as you're working on that, Robert Anthony, you know, to get, yeah, they're in the process of being encrypted. Thank you. We are aware of it and, writing statements about it, working to say this is a bad idea. It's going to limit access for those who need it. So certainly if there's any additional work that you think can be done, send a note to me, to FPF, and it is something we're aware of.
Yeah, and RCFP, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, they have staff attorneys, so they can field some of those questions. It's a nonprofit, so I would encourage you to connect with a staff attorney there, see what kind of guidance you can get from them. All right, we are to our traditional last question as we wrap things up here. What does press freedom mean to you, Kirstin?
I'm going to answer like an editor. So I'm also gonna clock myself right now. I'm 47, finished my undergraduate in this is important. I left my undergraduate in 99, went right to a legacy newspaper, and the definition for me of press freedom has changed over the years, and that's the important part. When I left university and, You do not have to graduate from journalism school to be a journalist. We understand that now. I did not have such a wide understanding at the time. This was the path. I was so excited, and I did not think about press freedom for many, many years. Yes, an undergraduate had a journalism in the law course, just like many of us here, and it was a noun. That's what the other, and it was a thing that we had, like an umbrella, this object that we had. Many years later, you know, as an assigning editor, as a team lead, I've always been a desk jockey, as they say, for in the journalism world, and I would field phone calls from people upset, but they were always upset about how we covered something. They might not have liked that we did it or how we did it. And I certainly took many phone calls, many emails, some letters. I'm sure we all have, but never the question of, do we have the right to do it? And these past 6+ years with Freedom of the Press Foundation have been at such a turning point for the United States overall. And it was happening years before. I admit I was probably very naive because it never came to me as a working journalist. But now I see every day on a day-to-day basis what is happening to journalists and journalism as an institution. And I really understand press freedom as a verb now, much more as an active living creature. I think of it as a
Wow.
to be verb. Like, do you remember, does everyone remember am, are, is, was, were, be, being, been, from middle school English? You know, it's freedomed. The press is freedomed. It has been freedomed. It, will be, has been, and that it's so active right now, which makes it a living organism and much more fragile. And my understanding has, really come along, changed over all of these years. I've been a working journalist.
Wow. I love that as an action verb. That's awesome. Please join me in thanking Kirstin McCudden for an interesting and fascinating conversation made possible by each of you and your great questions. If you want to be informed of future IC talks, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. I think Dan has put that in the chat. And you can also drop us a line at the email address there in the chat box. And you may want to use that here in a moment because the IC No Agenda conversation is tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. This is a time for people to get together and chat. There is no agenda. That's why it's called the No Agenda Talk. So again, many thanks to Kirstin and each of you for joining us this evening. Be careful, stay well, and may the journalism be with you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.